The world of cinema has just been torn apart by grief. Its golden lights have dimmed, its heart lies fractured, as Diane Keaton, one of the most luminous souls ever to grace Hollywood, has departed this life at the age of 79. On October 11, 2025, in the stillness of her California home, the final breath of a woman who redefined truth and tenderness slipped quietly into eternity. And when the news broke, the world seemed to freeze, because how do you say goodbye to a woman who made you feel seen even in your loneliest hour? Her passing has left a hollow ache not only in her family's hearts, but in the soul of an entire generation who once found themselves reflected in her laughter and redeemed by her courage. For more than 5 decades, she was not merely an actress, she was an era. She shattered conventions, challenged what femininity could be, and through films like The Godfather and Annie Hall, she forever rewrote the language of love, pain, and imperfection on screen. She was the heartbeat of a golden Hollywood, quirky, fearless, endlessly human. But behind that unforgettable smile was a lifetime of solitude and sorrow that no spotlight could disguise. The woman who made millions laugh was herself bleeding in silence. Her secret battles, the love that slipped away, the loneliness that lingered behind applause all became invisible threads woven into the fabric of her art. Time, relentless and merciless, has now written its final act. It has taken from us a spirit forged in both grace and agony, a woman who turned heartbreak into poetry and silence into music for the soul. What we are witnessing today is not merely the death of Diane Keaton, it is the collapse of a monument, the extinguishing of a flame that once lit up generations. Her laughter, once echoing through the decades, now fades into a whisper of eternity. The silence she leaves behind is almost unbearable, because it is the silence of a legend who taught us that even broken hearts can still shine, that solitude can still be love. Before we begin this remembrance, press the like button as a final tribute to Diane Keaton, a woman who gave her heart to the world until the very end. And please write R.I.P. Diane Keaton below as a candle of prayer for her soul, so that the light of our love may follow her into forever. It's heartbreaking to think that a woman who gave the world so much light began her life in such quiet sorrow. The world is still reeling from her loss. And yet, to truly understand who Diane Keaton became, we must return to the silence that made her. Born on January 5, 1946, in Los Angeles, California, she grew up beneath the warm sun of Hollywood's dreamland, a city where perfection was a religion and emotions were something to hide. Her father, Jack Hall, a gentle civil engineer, believed discipline was love. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Keaton Hall, crowned Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, once glowed with theatrical ambition. But that radiance faded behind the curtains of domestic life. Inside the Hall home, appearances were everything: 4 children lined up for dinner, grace before meals, laughter saved for guests. Beneath it all lived a silence so heavy it shaped her bones. "I grew up in a family that didn't talk about feelings," she would later confess. "We simply lived inside them." Those words, spoken decades later, carry the weight of a lifetime spent translating silence into art. As a little girl, she watched her mother's dreams die not in flames, but in slow motion. Dorothy's life became a series of small surrenders, the applause replaced by the clatter of dishes, the mirror that once reflected beauty now a witness to exhaustion. Diane would stand at the kitchen doorway, only 9 years old, watching her mother smile for everyone but herself. "I realized my mother's life was a warning, not a map," she would later write in her memoir. Then again, that realization carved a vow into her young heart: "I will not live my mother's life." While other girls in the 1950s dreamed of white fences and forever homes, Diane dreamed of escape, scripts, lights, a stage where she could finally exist as her own creation. Teachers called her difficult, classmates called her strange. But Diane wasn't broken, she was breaking free. Even then, her rebellion was quiet but volcanic, the kind that burns from within without making a sound. Her salvation arrived in high school under the trembling glow of a spotlight. She played Blanche DuBois, trembling herself, but fearless. "That was the first time I felt seen," she recalled years later. "It wasn't acting, it was survival." By 1966, at just 20 years old, she packed her dreams and pain into a single suitcase and left Los Angeles for New York City. She enrolled at the neighborhood playhouse, carrying with her her mother's lost ambitions and her own silent defiance. She dropped Hall and took her mother's maiden name, Keaton, both a tribute and a rebellion. "Every time they say Miss Keaton, they're saying my mother's name," she once said softly, as if still trying to heal her mother through art. And now, as the world mourns her passing, that vow still echoes through time. The child who once drowned in silence became the woman who turned silence into her greatest voice. And through that voice, she gave generations permission to feel, to speak, and to be seen. The silence that once haunted her childhood followed her into the roaring chaos of New York City. It was 1966, and winter hung over Manhattan like a punishment, gray, endless, and cold to the bone. Barely 20, Diane stepped off a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles carrying a single suitcase, 2 worn scripts, and the fragile courage of someone determined not to vanish. The first gust of city wind struck her like truth, merciless, sharp, and utterly indifferent. She found a narrow apartment on the Upper West Side, its wallpaper peeling, its walls so thin she could hear the neighbors' arguments bleed into her dreams. The radiator coughed instead of warming. The window leaked cold like a wound. Every night, she fell asleep in her coat, her breath fogging against the glass as snow pressed against the pane. Outside, the city pulsed and glittered. But in that room, the silence was louder than traffic. She learned quickly that New York was not a dream, it was a test of endurance. And here, survival was not luck. It was art. Mornings came gray and bitter. She stood in endless lines for auditions that ended before they began, tiny rooms above coffeehouses, the air thick with cigarette smoke and disappointment. Too tall. Too strange. Not the type. The words clung to her like frost. Still, she kept walking, her shoes thin, her pride thinner, her will unbroken. By noon she was a waitress, serving tables where no one remembered her face. By night she sang in basements so smoky the walls seemed to breathe, her trembling voice rising above the hum of conversation and the metallic clink of spare change in a glass jar. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed down the alleys, she walked the streets to stay warm, too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to quit. Some nights she shared a sandwich with another girl from the playhouse, both laughing through hunger at the cruel comedy of being young, invisible, and alive. The radiator coughed instead of warming, she later wrote, but I stayed because I was afraid all the time and fear became my engine. That fear carried her through weeks of hunger and months of silence. Dinner was often tea and half a slice of bread she pretended was enough. She pawned old shoes to pay rent, skipped the subway to buy coffee, and wrote lines of dialogue by candlelight when the power was cut. There were nights when she pressed her hands to the cold window just to feel something real. Mornings she wrapped her scarf twice around her neck and walked miles to save a nickel on bus fare. The city was deafening, she would later say, but I had never felt more unheard. Her notebooks filled with words no one would read, letters to her mother, to herself, to the dream she refused to bury. And when despair came too close, she would whisper to the dark, "Not yet." Loneliness became her shadow, but somewhere beneath it, a quiet fire began to burn, a stubborn, holy kind of hunger that refused to die. Then in 1968, after 2 years of rejection, fear, and near starvation, the call came that would change everything. A Broadway revival called Hair was searching for someone raw, unpolished, painfully real. Diane auditioned barefoot, nervous, trembling, but utterly alive. For the first time, she didn't perform for approval. She performed to survive. The director watched her in silence, then whispered, "Don't change a thing." That night, she stood under the heat of the stage lights, barefoot again, her heartbeat echoing in the dark. As the music swelled, something inside her broke open. The silence she had carried for 20 years cracked into sound. The audience didn't see perfection, they saw truth. And when she later said, "I built myself out of fear," it was no metaphor. It was confession. Fear, hunger, rejection, cold, they were her bricks and mortar. Every no had taught her to stand taller. Every unpaid bill had sharpened her humor. Every lonely night had shaped the courage that would one day define her. Long before the Oscar, before the Godfather, before the world called her extraordinary, there was only this: a young woman walking through snow with empty pockets, her breath visible in the freezing dark, and a spirit that refused to freeze. That is where the legend began, not in comfort, but in cold. Not in applause, but in silence that finally learned to speak. The snow of New York had melted into spotlight. The silence that once cloaked Diane Keaton's life was now replaced by applause so loud it seemed to echo across the world. From the trembling young woman who once sang for spare change, she became the face that defined an era. The Godfather came first, in 1972, and with it, the beginning of everything. As Kay Adams, she stood in the shadow of Al Pacino's Michael Corleone, a quiet witness to power and loss. The film earned her more than fame, it gave her the voice she had been fighting for since childhood. Then came Annie Hall in 1977. The role that would etch her name into cinematic history. That awkward laugh, the turtlenecks, the unfiltered honesty, they weren't costume, they were Diane. For the first time, Hollywood didn't just see a woman on screen, it saw truth wrapped in imperfection. The world fell in love, and so did the industry. She was 31 when she held that golden statue under the blinding lights, and for a moment, she thought she had finally arrived. But when she returned home that night, the applause still ringing in her ears, she set the Oscar on the counter, looked around her empty kitchen, and whispered to herself, "Is this what it feels like to be seen?" Every spotlight casts a shadow, and hers was already growing. The success that millions envied became a cage only she could feel. Each new script carried the same unspoken question, can you ever be that good again? Fame had its own weather, beautiful, brutal, and impossible to control. On set, she worked until her eyes stung and her hands trembled, memorizing lines long after the crew went home. "I didn't sleep," she later admitted. "I was scared to stop." Between takes, she hid in dressing rooms, rewriting scenes no one had asked her to change, chasing a perfection that didn't exist. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. Her laughter, once spontaneous, started to sound rehearsed. The pressure of being Diane Keaton became its own performance. There were nights she would drive through Los Angeles with the windows down, letting the cold air burn her face, trying to remember what it felt like to simply exist. "I used to think success would make me whole," she once said. "But maybe it just gave me permission to be broken in public." When Reds came in 1981, directed by Warren Beatty, she carried the film with everything she had left. The role demanded her mind, her heart, her sanity. "I remember crying in the car after filming," she confessed. "Not because I was sad, but because I had nothing left to give." The movie won acclaim, but Diane felt emptied, like a candle that had burned too beautifully to survive its own flame. And then came the inevitable silence after the storm. The mid-1980s brought films that faltered. The Little Drummer Girl, 1984, ambitious and demanding, barely earned back half of its $8 million budget. Critics were cold, box offices colder. For a woman who had once defined modern cinema, it felt like free fall. "It was strange," she recalled years later. "Everyone thought I was still on top, but inside I was slipping." For a while, she disappeared from the screen not out of defeat, but exhaustion. She turned down roles worth millions because fame without truth felt like another kind of failure. The Hollywood that once chased her moved on to younger faces and fresher stories. Yet Diane did what she had always done, she kept searching. She wrote, she directed, she rebuilt herself quietly in the shadows of her own legend. "The applause fades," she once told a young actress. "But the work, that's what saves you." She learned to find peace in solitude, to see art not as glory but as prayer. For Diane Keaton, success was never the destination, it was the fight itself. She learned that glory is heavy, that even light can burn, that greatness isn't given, it's endured. Every sleepless night, every trembling hand, every whispered doubt became part of her legend. The woman the world adored for her laughter had built that laughter out of fear. The woman who embodied freedom had paid for it with pieces of herself. And though history remembers the Oscars, the red carpets, and the timeless roles, what truly defined her were the hours no one saw, the rewrites at 3 a.m., the tears behind closed doors, the courage to keep showing up when the world had already moved on. In the end, she realized that the brightest lights are often the loneliest. Yet she never cursed them, because they had shown her who she was. That was her triumph. That was her art. And now, somewhere beyond the noise, that same silence that once broke her has found her again, not as punishment, but as peace. It is cruel how love can outlive the ones who carried it. Even now, as the world mourns Diane Keaton, That love, the one she never escaped, still lingers like a ghost in every frame she left behind. It was never a headline romance. It was a secret symphony, soft, steady, and destined to echo long after the music stopped. Every great soul carries one heartbreak that time cannot erase. And for Diane Keaton, it was a man named Pacino. What if the love that defined your life was also the wound that never healed? Theirs wasn't the kind of love that burned fast and vanished, it was the quiet kind, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. They met in 1971 on the set of The Godfather. She was 25, radiant, all nervous laughter and unguarded hope. He was 31, brilliant and unknowable, already half lost in the shadow of his own genius. Something unspoken began to hum between them, a frequency only two lonely hearts could hear. I was crazy about him from the start, she later confessed. Those who saw them together said it wasn't passion they shared, but recognition, two souls who understood the ache of wanting the world and still feeling incomplete. In those first years, happiness was disarmingly simple. Between takes they would sit together, the silence between them alive with meaning. Sometimes they read lines from the script, sometimes they just watched the sunlight shift across the studio walls. She made him laugh until he hid his grin behind his hand. He made her feel safe in a world that demanded too much. "We didn't need to talk," she said once. "It was enough just to be there." After filming, they would drive through Los Angeles with the windows down, Sinatra humming through the radio, her laughter tumbling into the wind. He cooked pasta in a too-small kitchen. She made tea, and they'd eat cross-legged on the floor, talking about everything and nothing. When he drifted to sleep on the couch, she'd watch him in the half-light and let herself imagine a life that might have been Sunday mornings with newspapers and laughter, birthdays and children with his dark eyes and her crooked smile. A small house by the sea where love could finally rest. For Diane, it was love at its purest and most dangerous, unclaimed, undefined, but absolute. She believed that someday, when the noise of Hollywood quieted, they would build something lasting, a home filled with light, photographs, and the sound of belonging. Through the Godfather trilogy, their on-screen story mirrored the one they were too afraid to finish off-screen, intense, elusive, full of yearning that never found resolution. During part 2, they wandered New York streets until dawn, their coats pulled close against the wind. He'd quote Shakespeare, she'd answer with laughter too bright for the hour. "I thought maybe," she said once, "if I kept showing up, he'd see me the way I saw him." But Al Pacino was a man haunted by distance. Fame frightened him. Commitment felt like a cage. "I avoid doors that might lead to pain," he admitted years later. And Diane, fearless and all heart, walked through every one of them anyway. By 1990, when The Godfather Part 3 began filming in Rome, she was 44, and hope still flickered inside her like a stubborn flame that refused to die. They stayed in the same villa overlooking the city's golden light, sharing dinners on a balcony strung with fairy bulbs, laughing over memories that felt like promises. Sometimes she caught herself imagining how his name might sound beside hers on an envelope, how their children might inherit both his fire and her faith. Everyone thought this was it, the final act of a love story that had waited 2 decades to be named. And for Diane, it truly felt like destiny finally arriving. She believed that after years of waiting, the story was ready to end not in silence, but in forever. One evening, beneath the slow-falling light of the Roman dusk, Diane finally gave voice to the ache she had carried for 20 years. The air was honey gold, the kind that makes even heartbreak look holy. "Marriage or goodbye," she whispered, her voice trembling not with anger, but with surrender, the last prayer of a woman who had waited too long to be chosen. The table between them was littered with half-drunk wine, untouched bread, the remnants of an evening that could have been eternity. "I can't live in the in-between anymore," she said softly. Outside, the olive trees stood still, their silver leaves frozen against a sky the color of forgiveness. Somewhere a church bell tolled in the distance, one slow, haunting note that seemed to pause the world. He looked at her, then away. No storm, no fight, just the unbearable stillness of a man retreating into himself. That silence, gentle, devastating, was his answer. He didn't have to say no, she would whisper later. The silence said it for him. In that moment, something in her, bright, stubborn, endlessly hopeful, finally shattered. The woman who had waited years for words realized she would die without hearing them. That night, she packed quietly, folding her dreams between clothes that smelled faintly of wine and regret. Before dawn, she stood by the villa window, watching the horizon bruise into light. The sky was indifferent. The city still asleep. She didn't cry. She simply left. When the plane lifted off, Rome spread beneath her like a painting she could never step into again. The seat beside her was empty, had always been empty, and now it always would be. Days later, the phone rang. Her father had collapsed, a brain tumor. While she was mourning one love, she began losing another. 2 heartbreaks arriving hand in hand stripped her bare. That was when I broke, she said years later. Not loudly, just quietly broke. Airports, hospitals, funeral flowers, life blurred into a haze of white rooms and unspoken prayers. In therapy, she searched for the woman she used to be, tracing the ruins of everything she had given away. I kept asking him to love me the way I loved him, she confessed once, her voice trembling even after decades. But love doesn't always echo back. She learned painfully that some people love by leaving, that the truest cruelty isn't rejection, but the silence that follows it. In the years that followed, she rebuilt herself the only way she knew how, through art, through laughter, through work that demanded everything and returned only moments of peace. She never married. She never sought public romance again. I guess I was waiting, she said softly once, but I didn't know for what. Instead, she poured her heart into the world, into films, into restoring forgotten houses, into her 2 adopted children, Dexter and Duke, whom she called the loves that stayed. Yet even as her laughter returned to screens, it carried a trace of something eternal, a softness that comes only from women who have known what it means to lose everything and keep living anyway. Her characters grew older as she did, funny, brave, lonely, unbreakable. Through them, she told her truth that heartbreak doesn't end, it simply teaches you how to walk with an open wound. Then came 2017. The American Film Institute honored her life's work. The auditorium shimmered under chandeliers full of applause and ghosts. And then, from the wings, Pacino appeared. The crowd gasped, time folded, and the years collapsed into a single trembling heartbeat. He walked to the podium, older now, eyes softer, voice uncertain. "I love you forever," he said. The room erupted, but Diane didn't cry. She smiled, a quiet, steady smile that belonged to a woman who had already grieved in every possible way. Because she had cried all the tears the world would never see, in therapy rooms, in midnight kitchens, on long drives home where she rehearsed goodbyes no one heard. That night, her smile said what her soul had long accepted: some loves don't end. They simply become ghosts that never stop breathing. And so she carried that ghost until her final days. When asked if she regretted never marrying, she laughed, soft and tired. "No," she said. "I have everything I ever wanted, except the thing I thought I needed." She understood at last that love isn't measured by duration or vows or photographs. It's measured by how deeply it changes you. And Al Pacino changed her not by staying, but by leaving. In surviving that love, Diane Keaton became something more than a star. She became proof that some hearts are too vast to be held by one lifetime. Her story is not merely about heartbreak, it's about endurance, grace, and the kind of courage that blooms in ruins, a woman who gave her heart to someone who couldn't hold it and still kept loving the world anyway. Even now, as her name drifts into eternity, that love remains between 2 souls who never learned how to let go. And maybe that's the cruelest, most beautiful kind of love, the one that doesn't die but haunts you gently, like a whisper you keep hearing long after the person is gone. The kind that leaves you shattered and somehow more whole. Grief doesn't knock, it breaks the door. In the same cruel breath that Diane Keaton watched the love of her life slip away in silence, fate struck again. Just weeks after returning from Rome, where hope had died under the Italian dusk, her father, Jack Hall, collapsed. The diagnosis was merciless, a brain tumor. The timing was so brutal it felt deliberate, as if life itself had decided to take everything that ever steadied her. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and goodbye. Machines hummed with false mercy, tracing lines that kept fading, then fighting, then fading again. Diane sat at his bedside, clutching the hand that once held hers on the way to school, whispering words that broke against the sterile walls. "Don't go yet, Dad," she murmured. "I'm not ready." But death never waits for permission. Jack Hall had been her quiet compass. He never told her to be softer, smaller, or easier to love. He was the one who stood outside auditions reading the newspaper in silence, waiting to drive her home whether she got the part or not. "Next time, kiddo," he'd smile. And somehow, that one sentence rebuilt her courage every time the world tore it down. He was her proof that love could be steady, that care could exist without condition. Losing him was like losing the last light left on in the house. After he was gone, the lamp on his desk stayed lit for weeks, as though even electricity refused to admit it. She would walk into his study, touch the worn wood, and whisper, "I'm trying, Dad. I really am." But the silence that answered back was the kind that changes a person forever. The months that followed were a descent no camera ever captured. She couldn't look in the mirror, her reflection felt like a stranger's. Her famously sharp wit turned inward, cutting instead of shielding. Friends stopped calling. She stopped answering. The house grew still, haunted not by ghosts, but by the absence of sound. "I broke then," she said years later. Not loudly, just quietly broke. Every morning she made tea and forgot to drink it. Every night she left a lamp burning in case grief ever decided to leave. Therapy became her last ritual, not to heal, but to stay alive. Week after week, she sat in a small room unspooling years of silence, facing the truth she had spent a lifetime avoiding, that love, for her, had always been a waiting room. "I don't think people realize what it means to feel like you're never the first choice," she confessed once, decades later. It wasn't bitterness. It was anatomy, a truth carved into her bones. By then she had lost the two men who defined her heart, one to death, the other to distance, and somewhere in between, she lost herself too. The heartbreak wasn't cinematic. It was slow, quiet, merciless. It lived in empty rooms, in the buzz of the refrigerator at midnight, in the echo of her own footsteps down hallways that used to hold laughter. Fame couldn't fill it. Awards couldn't numb it. The real agony wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative, the kind that gathers grain by grain until one day you realize you're buried under it. But from that rubble, she did something few people ever do, she rebuilt herself alone, slowly, defiantly. She stopped waiting for someone to come home and began building a home inside herself instead. She learned to live without the illusion that someone would save her and found, to her quiet surprise, that she didn't need saving anymore. Out of the ashes of loss, she became her own constant. The silence that once destroyed her became the space where she finally learned to breathe. And then the curtain fell. Long before that final morning, Diane Keaton had already crafted the only family she ever truly needed. After years of giving her heart to love that slipped through her fingers, she found a new kind of devotion, not romantic, but eternal. In her 50s, when many in Hollywood were retreating from the screen, Diane began a new act entirely, motherhood. In 1996, she adopted her daughter, Dexter, and 5 years later, her son, Duke. "They saved me," she would later say. "I thought I was done with love." Then they arrived, and suddenly everything began again. Her home filled with laughter, late-night talks, and music echoing down hallways once haunted by solitude. She built tree houses instead of movie sets, packed school lunches instead of scripts. In them, she found the love that never left. "I used to think I wanted romance," she once joked, "but turns out, I just wanted family." And in those two young souls, she found it, a quiet, unshakable love that carried her through every winter of her life. In her final years, Diane Keaton lived exactly as she always had, quietly, deliberately, surrounded by the spaces she had built and the silence she had long ago made peace with. The gardens she planted in her Brentwood home bloomed wildly that autumn, lavender and sage perfuming the air, their resilience a reflection of her own. Her silver hair caught the morning light like glass. The laughter that once echoed across studios now lived only in her kitchen, shared with her loyal dog padding softly by her side. She no longer sought the spotlight, she sought stillness. Each dawn she walked barefoot through her garden, whispering to the trees, "You're still here. So am I." On the morning of October 11, 2025, the California sun rose gently over Brentwood, spilling gold through the wide windows of her favorite room, the library she called the quiet house. On her desk sat a teacup still warm, her reading glasses resting atop an open journal. She had been writing about love, as she so often did. Her daughter Dexter was the first to notice the stillness. She found her mother resting in her favorite armchair, head tilted toward the window, eyes half closed as if lost in thought. The tea still steamed, the room still held her presence, but Diane was gone. No struggle, no sound, just a breath that slipped into eternity. "Mom," Dexter whispered. The silence that answered was unbearable. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, calling her brother Duke, her voice breaking. "She's gone." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the house, once filled with her quiet strength, felt cavernous, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of what had been lost. Later that morning, the family released a short statement. Diane Keaton passed peacefully at her home, surrounded by light, love, and the world she built with her own hands. But peace for the world meant devastation for those who loved her. In the hours that followed, Dexter and Duke sat in the garden she had tended herself, their grief blooming where her flowers once stood. They spoke softly of her rituals, her morning tea, her long walks, her endless notebooks filled with reflections she never shared. "She used to say solitude wasn't loneliness," Dexter murmured. "But now it feels the same." Her children decided there would be no grand ceremony, no cameras, just candles, soft music, and words spoken beneath the trees their mother had planted. That evening, the house glowed from within, windows lit with flickering gold, the same warm light that had followed her all her life. The news broke at dawn in Hollywood, and the world seemed to stop. People magazine was the first to confirm it. Oscar-winning actress and beloved icon Diane Keaton has died at 79. Within minutes, her face filled every screen in America. Headlines mourned the loss of a soul of truth and tenderness. Talk show hosts paused mid-broadcast, their voices trembling. On social media, fans flooded timelines with black and white photos of her, the turtlenecks, the laughter, the eyes that always seemed to know more than they said. Outside her Brentwood home, a small crowd began to gather. They brought flowers, candles, and neatly folded white turtlenecks, the uniform of a woman who made imperfection fashionable. Someone left a small handwritten sign at her gate: "You made us brave enough to be ourselves." Hollywood's greats wept openly. Al Pacino, her once great love, released a simple, trembling statement: "She was my heart's quiet mirror." Meryl Streep wrote, "She made vulnerability heroic." Steve Martin, who shared her wit on and off screen, remembered her as the funniest, wisest, most original voice our craft ever had. Woody Allen, in a rare public reflection, said, "There was no Diane Keaton before her, and there will be none after." Bette Midler called her brilliant, beautiful, extraordinary, America's treasure. Leonardo DiCaprio, who worked with her when he was just 18, wrote, "She was endlessly kind, endlessly curious, and always unapologetically herself." Kimberly Williams Paisley, who once played her daughter in Father of the Bride, shared a photo of their embrace and wrote, "She taught me how to laugh through heartbreak." That night, the Academy released a tribute reel, her smile lighting up screens from Los Angeles to Rome. Annie Hall, Reds, Marvin's Room, Something's Gotta Give, scene after scene, love and loneliness intertwined. Over a soft piano score, her voice played in the background, "Love is the greatest risk. But I'd take it again." Across theaters, even strangers cried. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was recognition. A generation was saying goodbye to its mirror. But grief was not only cinematic, it was deeply personal. In cafes across America, people spoke her name as though mourning a friend. Older couples who had watched her in the 70s held hands in silence. Women of every age left comments beneath her photos: "She made us feel seen." In classrooms, acting students played her scenes and cried between takes. Across social media, tributes poured in, not as noise but as gratitude. "She didn't just act," one post read. "She gave shape to the feeling of being human." It was as if a piece of collective memory had been ripped away, a sound that would never play again, a warmth that would never return. For half a century, Diane Keaton had been Hollywood's conscience, the woman who laughed through heartbreak, who wore her armor with wit and grace, who made imperfection beautiful. Her passing wasn't just the loss of a star, It was the end of an era where sincerity still mattered, where truth could still stand quietly in a room and command the world's attention. That night, as the headlines dimmed and the noise of morning softened, her Brentwood home remained lit, golden against the dark. The jasmine she planted brushed against her windows in the wind, as if the earth itself refused to let her go. Inside, her journals sat untouched, her glasses resting beside them. The last line she ever wrote read, "I used to fear being alone. Now I think. Aloneness is where love returns." Outside, the world wept. Inside, her absence hummed like a sacred note. And perhaps that is how she would have wanted it, not with fanfare, but with silence. The same silence that began her story and the same silence that, in the end, set her free. In the home she built with her own hands, beneath the soft California light, Diane Keaton's final act was the same as her first, a quiet defiance against the fear of disappearing. Because now, she never will. In the end, Diane Keaton's greatest legacy was not measured in trophies or applause, it was carved in brick, sunlight, and silence. What she built over nearly 6 decades was not merely a fortune, it was an architecture of resilience, each wall a monument to a life survived on her own terms. Her net worth at the time of her passing was estimated at over $100 million, though every dollar carried the echo of sacrifice, every stone the memory of solitude. She never inherited wealth, never married into comfort. Everything she owned, she built with her hands, her vision, and the same relentless spirit that had once carried her through hunger and heartbreak in New York. Her beloved Brentwood estate, valued at nearly $30 million, was her masterpiece, designed and restored by her, a sprawling, sunlit sanctuary wrapped in ivy and memory. Every tile, every beam, every pane of glass bore her fingerprint. Inside, light poured across reclaimed wood floors, walls lined with black and white photographs she had taken herself, images of quiet hallways, abandoned barns, forgotten towns. It wasn't a mansion. It was a reflection, a house that breathed her story. Friends said she called it the Quiet House, a name that now feels prophetic. Her children, Dexter and Duke, planned to preserve it exactly as she left it, a living archive of her art and solitude. But that was only one piece of her real estate tapestry. Over the years, she became one of Hollywood's most respected architectural visionaries. She once bought and restored a 1927 Spanish Revival estate in Beverly Hills, later sold to Madonna for nearly $6.5 million. She rescued multiple Los Angeles landmarks from decay, turning them into works of art that appeared in Architectural Digest and House Beautiful. One of her former homes in Sullivan Canyon, recently valued at $28.9 million, remains one of the most sought-after properties in Los Angeles. "I love buildings the way some people love people," she once said. "You can save them. You can rebuild them." It was her way of creating permanence in a world where everything else had slipped through her fingers. Her car collection spoke the same quiet poetry. The 1960s Mercedes Pagoda, her favorite, still gleamed in the Brentwood garage, a symbol of timeless grace. The G-Class SUV, her daily companion in later years, sat beside it like a modern sentinel. Every object she owned carried story, purpose, and restraint. Even her wardrobe, immortalized through decades of interviews and photoshoots, was preserved with care. Rows of black turtlenecks, neatly pressed wide-leg trousers, and hats stacked like sculptures of identity. According to those close to the family, Diane had quietly arranged her affairs long before her passing, handled, as always, with grace, purpose, and care. Her estate reflected her values, divided primarily between her children, Dexter and Duke, and the causes she held closest to her heart, among them, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Los Angeles Conservancy, and several mental health initiatives she had supported privately for years. She wanted her money to restore what time had taken away, a close friend shared. Whether that meant a building or a heart, there was no grand statement, no Hollywood spectacle, only handwritten notes left in the margins of her journals. Simple. Human. Unforgettable. To her children, she wrote, "You were my lasting story." And in a sealed envelope addressed to both of them, she added, "Don't sell the garden. Let it grow wild. That's where I'll still be." Her art collection, valued in the millions, included California landscape photography, paintings by Edward Ruscha, and sculptures by women artists she admired but believed were overlooked. She arranged for many of those pieces to be donated to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, ensuring that beauty and female creativity would remain her enduring signature. And yet, beyond all the numbers and possessions, her truest wealth was invisible. It lived in the generations of women she inspired to stand alone without apology, in the homes she rebuilt from dust, in the laughter she left echoing across film history. "People think money makes you safe," she once told Vanity Fair. "But it doesn't. Love does. And when love leaves, you learn to build safety out of space and light." In her passing, Diane Keaton didn't just leave behind an estate. She left a blueprint, a life constructed brick by brick, heartbreak by heartbreak, until even the silence around her shimmered with meaning. Her fortune was immense, but what she built from it was priceless, the proof that solitude too can be sacred. And somewhere beyond the walls of her Brentwood home, as the jasmine climbs higher and the windows glow with evening light, her words remain, etched in memory, whispered by the wind through the garden she refused to sell. "Everything I ever built began as something I lost. And look how much I found." In the end, Diane Keaton's greatness could never be contained by the borders of a screen or the echo of applause. Her brilliance lived quietly in the sacred space between chaos and calm, in the way she chose gentleness over grandeur, truth over spectacle. She never demanded the world's attention, she simply earned it, one honest breath at a time. Through humor, courage, and an authenticity so raw it seemed holy, she redefined what it meant to be seen. Long after the spotlights dimmed, her spirit remained a soft fire burning against the dark. She was proof that grace could be fierce, that kindness could be defiant, that even silence could speak louder than fame ever could. She often said that acting was not pretending, it was confessing. And that's exactly what she did. Through every tremor of laughter, every crack in her voice, every glance that carried an ocean, she revealed the truth of being human. To countless women, she became the mirror they had been searching for, the one that didn't judge, didn't perfect, but reflected them as they were, flawed, beautiful, real. She showed the world that solitude was not emptiness, that aging was not decline, and that love, no matter how it ended, was always worth the risk. In an industry built on illusions, Diane Keaton was a rebellion wrapped in gentleness. She was the woman who refused to disappear, and in doing so, made every other woman braver. Her generosity ran deeper than headlines ever captured. She gave not to be remembered, but to repair. Millions of dollars quietly found their way to the Women's Cancer Research Fund, the Alzheimer's Association, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. "Preserve what's good," she once wrote, "whether it's a building, a mind, or a heart." For her, charity was not an act, it was a continuation of her art. The same hands that saved old houses also reached out to mend unseen pain. She believed in restoration, not just of walls and wood, but of people, of memories, of the things life tries to break. And she gave more than money, she gave permission. Permission to be unpolished, to be uncertain, to be alive in all the messy, marvelous ways the world often forbids. Emma Stone once said, "Diane made it okay for women to be both brilliant and strange." And Hathaway called her a compass for courage. And every young actress standing before a mirror now, buttoning a blazer, tying a scarf, choosing honesty over artifice is, in some quiet way, standing in her shadow. Her influence stretched beyond the lens into fashion, art, and the rhythm of our language. She turned imperfection into style, sincerity into power. She taught us that the truest rebellion was simply to be ourselves. In her later years, when asked what she hoped people would remember, she smiled and said, "That I kept trying. That I loved." And perhaps that was her greatest act of grace, to keep loving even when love hurt, to keep showing up even when life didn't return the favor. Her story was never about endless triumphs. It was about endurance, the kind that rises after heartbreak, that carries on after everyone else stops, that outlasts the applause. For Diane Keaton, legacy was never something she sought, it was something she became. Every line she spoke, every wall she restored, every soul she touched became part of a mosaic far greater than fame. Somewhere tonight, her laughter still drifts through the California wind, light, mischievous, unafraid. Somewhere the garden she planted keeps blooming exactly as she wished. Somewhere her children, Dexter and Duke, lift their faces to the morning sun and feel her there in the warmth, in the light, in the silence that feels like love. And for the rest of us, those who grew up watching her, who found pieces of ourselves in her vulnerability, her absence feels unbearable yet sacred. Because it is a silence filled with meaning. A silence that doesn't end, but hums with her spirit still. She did not fade away. She became part of the light, the kind that filters softly through morning windows, that forgives everything, that never stops shining. If her story has touched your heart tonight, let it stay there. Press like, not for numbers, but as a gesture of gratitude for the laughter she gave us, for the courage she taught us, for the love she left behind. And if her life meant something to you, write R.I.P. Diane Keaton not as goodbye, but as a quiet promise that her light will never dim. Because the truest stars do not live in the sky. They live in us, forever burning quietly, where the light never dies.